Let's take a look at drawing with the shape tools in Adobe Photoshop. Now, 9 times out of 10, if I want to draw with vector shapes, I'll reach for Adobe Illustrator. It's just more sophisticated in its way of drawing these objects. But Photoshop has actually gotten better over the last few years at dealing with vector shapes, so it's become a more viable option. You know, sometimes if you just need to draw something simple and you need it in Photoshop, you can reach for these shape tools and they'll do a good basic job for you. Basically what it does is you draw with a vector tool, and it creates a shape layer over in the layers panel, and you can manipulate it like most other layers. And sometimes you just want to use the special effects that you have access to in Photoshop. So maybe you don't want to jump over to Illustrator, draw something, and then jump back to Photoshop. If it's a simple enough image, you could just stay here in Photoshop and do it. So let's take a look. So the shape tools are over here at the bottom of your toolbox in Photoshop, near the bottom. And right now I've got the basic rectangle selected. So I'm going to draw a rectangle here. If I don't hold Shift down, I can draw a basic rectangle. If I do hold Shift down, it'll constrain it to a square. And it's filling and using the stroke of the previous object that I had selected. But I can change that up here in the control panel very easily, right? I can change the fill if I want to, right? And I can change the stroke color, right, to something else. I could even give it a gradient fill on that stroke, right? I'm going to go back to solid. Here, I'll show you on the regular fill. Like, you can switch to a gradient or even a pattern if you've got a pattern made, right? So some of the basic stuff that you can do in Illustrator, you can do now in Photoshop. So that's pretty handy. And of course, if you don't want to fill at all, you can click on that guy and it gets rid of the fill of the inside. And likewise, if I were to go to the stroke and say I don't want a stroke, it gets rid of it. One thing about that stroke, you can change the size of that, right? The weight of that stroke here, right? Or type it in. And you can change the options for that stroke, right? You could have a dashed line or dotted line, or you could align that stroke to the inside, which is the default, or to the center of the path or outside of the path, right? Some pretty handy options. You can change the corners, right? You could have rounded corners instead of square or mitered corners. And if you've got an open path, you can change the end caps, right, from flat to curved if you wanted to. So take a look at your stroke options. A little further along here, these are really handy. The path operations, you can actually combine shapes, subtract from shapes, intersect or exclude overlapping shapes. To be honest with you, I typically try to do this with the Shift or Option keys, but for instance, if I have this square selected and I choose Combine Shapes here, I can now draw a rectangle, right, that comes out from there. Stroke options are still set to miter. So you can see here that it's combined the two, right? They connect. By the way, the A key on the keyboard allows you to have access to the selection tools, right? There's the black arrow over here, right? That's the regular selection tool. And there's also the white arrow, the direct selection tool, which allows you to edit, right? And have access to individual anchor points. More about that in a minute. But so if I have that object selected, as long as it's selected and I'm in a mode like the combine mode, I can get my rectangle tool again, click and drag. Oops, gotta make sure We're in combine mode. Sorry about that. That's kind of hard to see. Let me try a little wider. I've got a really thick stroke. There we go. Get the idea? What if now again, I'm holding the command key down, and that temporarily gives me access to that selection tool, right? So command clicking off will deselect it, command clicking on will select it. Now I'm going to switch my mode to subtract front shape, right? Oops, hang on, got to deselect first before I select that, right? Subtract from front shape. I'm going to select this, and as long as that mode is still active, it will subtract. See that? You can also hold down the Option or Alt key, and it'll do the same thing, right? Except that time, it'll do it from the center instead of from the corner. Okay, so you can add to a shape or subtract from a shape to make more complex objects. And there's more, right? Like you can experiment with this, like intersecting shapes, exclude overlapping shapes, explore that. If I move on now to the rounded rectangle tool, right? Grouped with the other shape tools, here's the rounded rectangle tool. You can also hit Shift U. U is the shortcut for the shape tool. Shift U will cycle through the different tools in that group. So I click and drag here. Now I've got a rounded rectangle. If you notice in the properties panel that I can access the fill and stroke, and whether the stroke is inside, center, or outside, right? I can deal with the different caps, different options for the stroke. But this is interesting. With the live shape, you can actually change the rounded rectangle options, right? Like for instance, if I, well, I'm going to take the link off here. If I set those all to 0, right? Now I've only got one that's rounded over here, and I could modify that to increase how round it is, right? So, or I could, knock them all back down to 0 and, link them together and bump that up. And when I hit return, they'll all change to 30 pixel for the amount of roundness, right? Okay, so you've got options in the properties panel. All right, let's move on. Okay, here's an ellipse, right? There's the ellipse tool. You can, again, draw just an oval, or if you hold the Shift key down, it'll make it a perfect circle. And once again, like for instance, if I wanted to draw a donut shape, I could hold down Option or Alt, click and drag, and now it's a donut, right? Well, I'll have to get the selection tool, the regular move tool, to move this so you can see, right? I can see through it now. I've cut one circle out from the other by holding down the Option key. Ellipses, rectangles. Here's the Polygon Tool. Now this one draws from the center, and the default, I believe, is 5 sides. But I'm going to hit Command Z. If you were to come up here to the options bar at the top, you could change that to, say, 3 sides. Now I'm drawing a triangle. All right, all sorts of fun to be had. And, finally, over here is the line tool. You can draw lines. Now, it's a shape that looks like a line, and of course it can have a stroke just like any other of these objects, right? So you can draw individual lines. Anyway, take a look at the shape tools, mess around with them, see what kind of trouble you can get into, and again, like you can use them to create fairly simple illustrations or interface elements, right? Here's a wacky little duck. let me change my select tool to grab that whole group. Right, you can take these basic shapes and draw simple things in Photoshop, and sometimes more complex than this, obviously. And the nice thing is, like, you can, throw filters at it, and all the stuff that Photoshop does well, it's right there at your disposal. One thing that I should mention, like if I were to get the Ellipse tool again here and draw a basic ellipse, right? I can get the pen tool out and, I can subtract. Well, as soon as I do that, it tells me, okay, it's no longer going to be a live shape. So some of those options that you have when you're drawing with simple shapes in Photoshop won't be available to you any longer. Once you edit the thing, you've got a little more control, right? I can add anchor points wherever I want. And again, if you hold down the Command key while you've got the pen tool, you can modify the handles and the position of the anchor points, right? Let me undo that. And here, I'm going to hold down the Option key to get access to the Convert tool. If I click on a curved point with that, it'll make it a corner point. And again, if I hold down the Command key, it gives me access to the Direct Selection tool. I can edit that anchor point and its handles to control that curve. All right. And again, up here in the options bar at the top, I can get rid of that stroke if I don't want it. So you can draw with basic shapes and then start to edit them, right? And make like more complex illustrations if you need to. Make sense? So, but sometimes it's just handy to start with a basic shape and then use the pen tool to edit it. So practice, play around, see what you can do. All right, good luck.